So thank you for being here tonight. I have to say, it was very interesting to read both of your books in succession. Both of their books are available tonight at the table back here. If you want to pick one up, please do after our conversation. It's really interesting to read them one after another because you were a mentor working on In the Wake, and you were writing A Circle on the Surface at the same time. So I find it very interesting to read both of them. So first, let's talk a little bit about the mentorship program. So Carol, I know you've been a mentor
5 times now, and it's a wonderful program, and it's such a privilege as a writer to be able to see inside another writer's creative process to that extent. It's very, very cool. So yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of work, but it's very rewarding.
So what is the schedule like? You guys meet?
Well, 5 months. Yes, 5 months,
yeah.
and meeting every 2 weeks in person, and then emailing submissions in between and critiquing. We did a lot of work online, yes, and then we would meet in person to discuss it. And Nicola was just so dedicated and disciplined. She'd have this hard work done, and so then when we did meet, we could kind of go over what she had rewritten and so on. So it was a joy.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a real joy, and I've been so lucky because all the people I've worked with have been really focused like that, but Nicola and my most recent mentees or apprentices have been spot on. So it's been really wonderful.
So what do you think you've learned about your own writing by being a mentor?
You are constantly reminded of the value of what you do, because writing is so insular, and when you're squirreling away with your little stories in your room, you kind of forget about the significance of stories. But the fact is, what you were saying, what Marilyn Robinson says, is how I think we're hardwired to try to make sense of the chaos that is the world. And it is creating narratives that helps us to do that, however, whatever the form is of creating narratives. So, that's sort of, you kind of can lose sight of that. You can lose sight of how much fun it can be, also how bloody hard it is,
Yeah.
Again, and working with somebody else, it's one thing as a mentor to say, well, that's not quite working, why don't you try this? And you know how much work that's going to involve for the person, and it's much easier to say to somebody else, you do it.
Right.
And as opposed to being the person who just suggests things. But again, it's that real recognition of how amazing and really magical, maybe even mystical, the process is. And I think anyone who is a maker or creative person knows that.
So Nicola, that sounds beautiful. It's mystical, it's important. How does it feel to reveal an unfinished work to somebody, to read it critically? Is it mystical and beautiful?
No, it's terrifying. I think I told you when we first met that when we started the mentorship program, I didn't want Carol to see the whole thing, so I wouldn't give it to her right away. I would only give it to her in these little batches, and before I sent it to her, I would go over the whole batch and edit it again, and then send it to her. And then she would come back, and she always leads with compliments and encouragement. But I wanted critique, of course, and I had been working on the novel with my writers group for quite a while, so I had read pieces of it to people before, and I kind of knew where the strengths were, but I didn't know as a whole how it would fit together, and I just felt it was an enormous mess.
Right.
Which I have learned since we all tend to feel about our first draft, second draft, and so on. So, yeah.
So there's something very vulnerable, obviously, about revealing something you're still working on. But what was it like to have someone who had already worked on many novels to sort of be guiding you through the process? Did you ever feel that you were being pushed into a place that you wouldn't have pushed yourself? In a good way, I mean.
In a good way.
In a good way, yeah.
Were there things that Carol opened up to you, ways of thinking about your story that you didn't see yourself?
Yes, I mean, right away she picked up on pacing in the novel, and that's not something that I really knew how to do. So we talked about that immediately. And then the marital relationship within the novel was immediately a problem, and I think it still is. People still tell me how they feel about Daniel. Everyone's mad at Daniel. So Carol picked up on that really quickly, and so I started working on that immediately, trying to flesh out that character. And so yeah, Carol was able to articulate that to me, so I knew.
It's interesting that in both of your novels, there's a marriage at the core of the story. And I don't know if I would say a troubled marriage, because all of the relationships are very unspoken and subtle, but they're difficult relationships. I'd like to know, Carol, what story were you trying to tell about the female experience in a traditional family structure in your book?
Actually, that kind of came almost later in the process, because my allegiances to my main characters shifted greatly over the process of writing this, because I started it in 2011, right, and it came out last year, so that's a long process. And during that time, just getting to know the characters, I always flip-flopped. And I think, yes, ultimately it may be I think in most fiction by women, we're dealing with challenging those roles and looking at them and picking them apart and thinking, and that novel is set in the 1940s when things were even worse, although some things haven't changed that much. But, and sort of exploring the problems of that particular character, Una, who is a school teacher, and in those days, married women were not allowed to teach in the classroom, and you think, oh, what? But that influenced a lot of people's lives greatly, and so that was kind of her main problem, and I sort of took it from there.
And Nicola, similar to in your novel, a lot of the narrative, a lot of the story actually occurs in what the characters don't say to each other. So talk to me a little bit about the challenge of writing a story in what is unsaid between characters.
That is something I love so much about dialogue, is when you as the reader are privy to something that the characters are not. And so a lot of that came out in editing. So some of those cues may have been there in the initial drafts, but the more editing the book went through, the more I took that out and basically give the reader credit that they can understand that other layer.
You're also a photographer. So how did that influence your ability to tell stories without people actually talking to each other? At least not saying what they really mean ever, basically, in your book.
Yeah. Well, as a photographer, my favorite thing to do is to tell stories with images. And so that often means that if I was here tonight and I wasn't sitting here talking to you, I'd be behind that plant over there with my camera, watching all of your faces and anticipating when you're going to laugh and what's going to make you frown and so on. So I do the same thing in my imagination in the room with the characters. I will often act it out when I'm sitting in the chair writing. I'll think, well, how would I physically express that? And so I try to do that as much as I can without telling. So it's always the showing and not the telling.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, that's always the hard part.
It is, but the editing, you're right. I mean, that's how I got my dialogue too, because again, it's stripping it down so that there's no fluff, there's nothing extraneous, and it's really hard to do to get the nuances of how the characters are relating to one another. But it's editing, yeah.
But you're also dealing with characters who are dealing with depression, postpartum depression, and mental illness of various kinds in your books. So talk to me a little bit about what informed your ability to write those characters and how you approach something as complex as that, and being able to be compassionate to those characters, understand what's happening, and still communicate that to us as a reader. It seems like a really complicated balance.
My character suffers from tremendous isolation because in the community where she finds herself, she is very much the other. You know, again, she's a white middle-class woman, and so she doesn't really know extremely what it is like to be other. But she comes from a privileged background, and then the village she lives in is not so. It's pretty rustic, and it's her isolation that you can kind of see how when anyone is isolated and treated as other, how depressing that becomes for a person, regardless of the surroundings, you know, and in her case. And so it was kind of taking her situation and all of these social pressures that kind of conspire against her, really, and then what happens? How does somebody resist? And she does resist in her own way, but it's too hard, and so she really succumbs.
Right.
And that's what it is, you know. And in those days, again, her options are very limited. So she thinks, I'll have a child, you know. And she doesn't really want to be a mother, but she doesn't have any other things she thinks she can do in this scenario. So once she does become a mother, it's really not good. Mm-hmm. It's really not good, and it becomes even more isolating for her.
Right, and I think that's similar with your main character, Emily. There is a kind of isolation from her family. Something I find interesting about both your books is at the center there are female friendships. You have Linda and Emily, and you have Kit and Una in your book that seem to sort of understand each other in a different way than some of the other characters. Mm-hmm. How does that work in and outside of the novel? As mentor and mentee, how did that kind of help you with your writing? And in the novels, how do you think the characters use those female friendships? Maybe Nicola, I can start with you.
For my characters, because I've got one of my main characters, Emily, has had a history of depression, and then later on with postpartum depression. And then living next door is Linda, whose son is suffering with mental illness. So right away, Linda and Emily have that connection, understanding that people aren't always accepting of mental illness, and open discussion about it. So I think that kind of gives Emily and Linda that immediate bond where they can talk to one another about it. Are you talking as well about this sort of interplay with Carol and I, both of us having, you know, our own female friendship, talking about our characters? Yeah.
I think, certainly I think it made it easy because there's sort of this understanding between women friends. There's this understanding that we just know, and it's almost things are telescoped. You don't have to really go into it because it's like, oh yeah, we get, like that Daniel, he's just being an ass, right?
Yeah. There's a shorthand with women, I think.
Yeah, there is a shorthand, exactly. So I think that there was, automatically, for me anyway, we had this understanding, and I have to say, I don't know why you were so nervous about showing me your work, because it was great, you know, and right from the get-go, it was great. And you know, but I think we just had this understanding as soon as we got to know one another, just the opening meetings.
Yeah, and maybe your position as a mentor kind of makes you a bit of an ideal reader, I would think.
Yes, probably.
You obviously come with knowledge as a novelist yourself, but you're reading curiously, and you're informed. So let's just kind of think about why novels. There's a lot of ways that we can tell stories today. So Carol, what brought you to novel writing?
Because I've always loved reading novels, and you know, as a child, I always read novels, or you know, like Anne of Green Gables, and starting there, and so on. And so for me, it's always been, I love narrative. I'm sort of a narrative junkie, right? And again, reading novels is what I love. I also love short stories, and I love writing short stories, but novels, there's something about working on them. Once you finally get into it, it's like being in this little universe that, not that you're in control of it, because you really are not. You're just sort of on the sidelines just trying to take notes, right? But again, there's something, I love the enclosure of working inside a novel.
I really love that image of the novel as a little universe of its own that you get to peek into, and then you tell us about it.
I mean, it's not all pretty either. There's a lot of cursing that comes with that, you know. But it's challenging. It's very challenging, but it's really rewarding too.
Nicola, will you write another book, or did the first one just say that's it enough for me?
No, I'm well into book number 3.
Amazing.
And I wrote another one for NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month.
Yeah, that's November.
That's in November.
Yeah. Where you try and write a whole novel in a month. Is that the thing?
Yeah, you have to write 52,000 words in the month of November, and you're not allowed to start until November 1st. So I have that one sitting on a shelf somewhere, gathering dust. I'll
So
get
is
back to
anybody in for this November? Is anyone brave enough to do it?
that. No?
Nobody's committing. I see no one committing in the audience.
Katie is.
Yeah.
Well, it's been really wonderful to talk to you both, and thank you for being generous with talking about your process, because some people like to protect that a lot because it's scary. Sometimes it feels like if we talk about the things that we do in our creative spaces, it might go away. So I really appreciate you guys being here. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank
Carmel.
you for the invitation.
This was really fun.